And let's get started with an article in Bloomberg. It says that the United States is concerned about the strengthening ties between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And Richard, should they be concerned about this?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, they should be concerned. Whatever in the world that means, it's the kind of speech you get from a potentate who doesn't realize that he's not the potentate of anything anymore, but has not wanted to face that, and so talks in this peculiar language. We are concerned. What are we all supposed to be children looking up to the great personage who's concerned? I mean, it's so foolish that it only makes the people who talk like this look ridiculous. Of course, they're concerned. Half the reason that you see the alliance between Russia and China, North Korea, Iran, and so on is because of actions undertaken by the United States. If they're concerned, maybe they ought to wonder about their own contribution to this situation. Now, what we get is we're concerned, and that seems, if you ask the question, because they don't want to have to say it, that seems to be connected. Maybe this concern to what they're doing in Ukraine or what they're doing now in the Middle East. They are permitting, you know, the Chinese foreign minister, either yesterday or the day before, made it crystal clear. We are on the side of the Arabs. We are on the side of Lebanon and the Palestinians. They are our brothers, just so there would be no mistake about what he meant. And why would you think the Chinese take a position on these questions that are thousands and thousands of miles away from them? It's because they are very determined to be a reliable ally. And they have the clear sense that the United States is working itself into very dangerous dead ends in Ukraine in one way and in the Middle East in another way. They are losing. There's nothing much they can do. They lose either way. So for me, the concern is just another silly way to imagine that anyone pays attention to you when you talk like this. You think the Chinese are surprised to hear that the United States is concerned? I mean, it blows your mind at this level. I suppose it's intended to reinforce an American sense that we don't face the kinds of problems we do because it's not more than a matter of some concern. Look, the United States is involved in Ukraine. And on the other side is Russia. Russia is winning that war. Ukraine is losing that war. The United States has agreed to escalate that war over and over again. Level of funding, level of troops, Abram tanks, A-16 fighter jets, and now the question of the missiles into Russia and so on. Every escalation justified by enabling Ukraine to win. And after every escalation, Ukraine loses. This is the truth. It has nothing to do with concern. They understand that they terribly, badly underestimated Russia's power. And I mean Russia's military power, and I mean Russia's diplomatic power, its alliances. and even its economy. The Russians are now producing most of the munitions they use, and therefore they've been able to ramp up their economic machinery, even though they are infinitely small. And let me remind everyone, Russia is a $2 to $3 trillion GDP. On the other side of the war, Western Europe and the United States together, $30 to $40 trillion. You understand? It's a 20-to-1 ratio. And yet the Russians are outproducing munitions and everything else from their industrial economic base. The Americans didn't get that. The British didn't understand it. Their wonderful CIA and MI5 and all the rest of them didn't know, or possibly the leaders in the United States and Western Europe didn't care or didn't listen. It's quite clear now that the Pentagon doesn't want to give the Ukrainians anymore. It's not just Mr. Trump. It's the Pentagon under Biden that is telling him, don't do this. And part of the reason is, and I know this will upset people, but I'm just telling you what I read. I have no privileged access to any information that anybody else couldn't get. The Pentagon seems to believe that in a war now, Russia is better prepared than the West. Wow. This is David and Goliath, and I hate to tell you, but who's in which position? Russians are David, and we here are the Goliath waiting to be knocked over with a slingshot. This is an extraordinary situation. It is so far beyond the word concern that it is downright ridiculous to talk like that. Unless there's somebody you think you can continue, to fool with that kind of language. And I really think that number is shrinking too.
Yeah. Michael.
Well, you said that the United States was not only concerned, but alarmed. And these statements are almost a comic parody of how blind the United States and its diplomats have been by their own neoliberal policies. They've created a sense of urgency for other countries to band together to protect themselves from the U.S. actions that are aimed at preventing them from acting them in their own self-interest. As Benjamin Franklin said, if you don't hang together, you'll hang separately. So, of course, Russia, China, and Iran have joined together as part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. What's so laughable is the U.S. blind spot in not expecting other countries to fight back and create an alternative to the plans that the United States have. It's as if the United States thinks we can act and other countries won't respond. They have no choice but to do what we've said. After all, we've tried to put in place our own proxies as their leaders, just like we've done in Europe. We can treat other countries like we treated Iraq. We could just march in militarily, no resistance at all. We can do whatever we want. Economically, they can go to Europe and they can blow up Nord Stream pipeline and essentially block the European industrial recovery, and Europe will go along with it, won't do anything at all. So that's what makes the United States not only concerned, but actually surprised that this is happening. They did not take into account the idea that other countries will react, and that they will react in their own self-interest. And from the U.S. point of view, they can say, well, what self-interest after all? Can they have? They haven't really shown anything yet, just like Russia hasn't yet really fought back against NATO. The other countries together haven't created an alternative to the U.S. Diplomacy. And what they realize, reacting to the U.S. diplomacy isn't simply about the recent new Cold War attacks. It's not simply about Ukraine or about Israel. It's about the whole system that the United States set up after World War II to control the world, to the IMF and the World Bank. So what we're really seeing is the flowering of the drive for independence that started with the Bandung Conference in Indonesia 70 years ago. Their aim has remained constant: to protect their self-interest from being victimized by the world in which the U.S. diplomacy created in 1945, then created again in 1971 when it went off gold, and then in 1991 after the fall of the Soviet Union, a whole new world has been created basically under U.S. direction. And for the first time now, other countries are seeing the need to create their own alternative and to become independent. And the United States is just as unprepared for them acting economically and politically to join together as it was unprepared for other countries actually to fight back and to actually be stronger. Well, what Richard has just described in the military sense of, it turns out militarily, the U.S. Army itself has said Russia's stronger. Economically, the global majority is stronger, led by China, Russia, and Iran as the basic core for all of this. So the United States has started a war thinking that it was Goliath, thinking that anything it could do, other countries would only react passively and accept whatever the U.S. is doing. All of a sudden, that short-sightedness of economic planners and military planners has shown that the United States never thought of a plan B. And the plan B might include other countries acting on their own behalf. And that's what we're seeing right now. They're being driven to do this by the U.S. economic and financial and military aggression. They see themselves being essentially threatened, just as they're threatened by being turned into what's happened in Germany, in Europe, what's happened in Gaza and Lebanon. They don't want that fate to befall them. And now, for the first time, they're acting together.
Yeah.
I can give you, let me add just another example of this. I am struck, and I started looking over the last week in the financial press, how it reacts, because if you've paid attention, you'll know that over the last week or two, the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, has talked a great deal about tariffs, raising tariffs against Mexico. Particularly, there was a lot of discussion against the John Deere Corporation itself, an American producer of agricultural equipment, and so on, raising tariffs against Europeans, and just on and on. Here's what I want to point out. Not only does he feel comfortable in doing that, but in another way, the way the reports go, and I'm talking about the Wall Street Journal and financial reporting, they report what he says, they go into it, but they either don't say a word, or buried in the 9th paragraph of an article, there is a remark about how there's also a question of quote unquote retaliation. I mean, that's what Michael is talking about. What is this way of thinking? And again, it's not just Mr. Trump, but the editors and the reporters who write about all of this. What? There may be retaliation? Of course there'll be retaliation. We've already seen retaliation during the presidency of Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden since. There have been retaliations. There have been guarantees of retaliations. You know, we even saw a headline earlier this week that the Calvin Klein fashion house is going to be investigated in China, et cetera, and it's crystal clear that this is in part a retaliation against these China targeted tariffs. And there's look, I don't want to be poetic, but the poem suggests itself. In the act of what we call containing or isolating China. What is actually happening, occurring as if we weren't aware, is the isolation of the United States. We are giving the rest of the world every incentive not to rely on the US market, not to rely on financing from the US, that the US is an unstable, unreliable partner in economic transactions of various kinds.
Yeah.
That's a serious situation. And I think it goes to what Michael was saying. You can't do this as if every time you act, everybody will play the role you would like them to play in response. That's not retaliation, that's collapse. One final example. Back in the 1970s, when the United States began to face the fact that Germany and Japan had recovered from the war, had repaired their war-destroyed industries, and had developed new industries that were geared to outcompeting the United States, and they had achieved it. And suddenly American roads were filled with Japanese automobiles. And the United States said this has to stop. Well, the Japanese caved in. They agreed to quotas. For some years, the United States had a quota. You can bring so many Japanese-made cars here. That's it. A quota acts like a tariff. It blocks. The difference is it doesn't affect the immediate price. It just means after a certain number, you go to the dealer for the Toyota. You don't get a Toyota because there aren't any Toyotas. You've run out of your allowance for that year. And when that didn't work, the United States gave another dictate. You can produce your car, but it has to be done here. You can't bring it in. And the Japanese, what were they going to do? First of all, the United States was such an overwhelmingly important market. They could not afford not to make it for the American market. We are a much smaller part of the world market today than we were then. We don't play that kind of role, number one. Number two, they had nowhere else to turn. Now they do. And this is true for every country. The world has changed, and you're not going to get the collapse of the people negatively impacted by American economic policy. You're just not going to get it. And I don't think that has sunk in any more than that you can't dictate what happens in the Middle East and you can't dictate what happens in Ukraine. It hasn't sunk in. They just don't get it. They don't want to see it. They can't afford to see it. It's politically unpopular because you have not prepared your people to understand what's going on. When I talk in this country about the declining empire, I can, I'm a teacher. I watch my audience. I can see the difficulty that this very idea occasions in their minds. And I've learned, I studied enough British literature to know that the decline of the British Empire was very difficult for the British.